So, Dr. Bill, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been a long time.
Well, that's no problem whatsoever. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. We have certainly shared the mic in the past many times before, talking about some of our favorite things.
Yeah, and this is one of the favorite topics we'll talk about. It's something involving food, fellowship with people, and the joys of life.
Well, on the segments before bringing you on here, plus you on with me, we were talking with Nancy Diggs, who has written a book called In Search of Appalachia. And I was really fascinated when I saw and heard about her book, because I know that you and I have spent a considerable amount of time in the Appalachian region of North Georgia and North Carolina in particular. But you too are an author of all things Appalachia with your cookbook. So I wanted to have some conversation with you about that particular part of Appalachia. When we think about the culture, the food is always a big part when we talk about any culture, but certainly with Appalachia culture, I would think that it would include gathering things, farming, as well as hunting. Did I leave anything out?
That's about it. Those three things: farming, gathering, and hunting. And the Appalachia area is an incredible area. It's actually the forefront of, I'd say, this. It's at the gateway of the new culinary revolution in food. It's a tremendous area. It's a big area. It's almost as big as parts of Europe. Compared to parts of the whole continent. So these are huge areas with an incredible diversity, and a lot of it's mountain. And mountains are safe havens, but they're also tremendous diversity because they allow things to be separated, and they allow little places, little enclaves to exist that are untouched from by outsiders, which allow diversity to occur.
Well, a couple of things that you just said here that I really want to have a chance to talk a little bit further about. But I would love to start with talking about the region itself. You said there are a lot of mountains, so that allows for certain things. So how is that allowed for certain things in terms of food? Are there certain foods that would only be grown in the mountains, or what are you meaning by that?
It gives you multiple climates, a lot of microclimates.
Okay.
And these microclimates allow for various types of different types of plants to grow and animals to find niches in. And that's the beautiful thing about the Appalachian area. And that's true of mountains anywhere around the world. When you have a mountainous region, you get separation. Separation allows environments to separate. Separated environments allow species to differentiate.
Oh, I see. And then you also mentioned too that just where Appalachian cooking is moving to in this day and time. So tell us a little bit more about that. Because are there some particular things that if I eat that, I would know that I'm eating something that's part of the Appalachian foodways?
Well, one way of looking at it is this. You can never really understand things in isolation. You always have to understand things in relationship to other things. When people hear about the Appalachian culture, it's the culture of what they call Southern Highlanders, people from the Scottish Irish and some Dutch people coming in, and Scottish people from Dutch heritage moving into this region. But they weren't moving into that region by themselves. They were moving in that region with a group of other people that were there long before them, the indigenous people. They got the Cherokee. You had parts of the Creek that were areas in those areas there. You had the Seminole, the Iroquois. And these were Indians, but the largest group of Indians were the Cherokee. And these people had long since worked out how to survive in these regions. And you've basically got an interaction between these two. For food-wise, if you are a stranger to a new environment and you're going to bring your own food with you because you don't know what to expect. And the problem comes when you bring your own food with you, either you run out of it or the techniques and stuff how to provide or grow your own food don't work. Yeah. When they don't work, then you've got to reach out to who is there that has something to work. And then that's why you have these relationships developing between the Native Americans and Europeans on how to figure out to get a system in sharing crops. The Southern Appalachian area has a tremendous amount of unusual plants and certain animals, but particularly unusual plants. And some of them to this day are just being discovered. We spend way more time in research on the Amazon and what's present in the Amazon in that area than we do on what's actually present in our own backyard in the Appalachia, in Appalachia, America.
Well, I want to hear a little bit more also too, because I know it's going to tie in with the food. But what was the relationship then between the people who came and settled and the people that were native to the area? Because, like you mentioned, there wasn't any trying to sort out how to survive for them, because they've been doing that for thousands of years.
People do what's easy. And I say that because when the Europeans first came over here, they went to the Piedmont, the plains areas, the eastern plain areas, because the land was flat, you had rivers flowing through it, and a lot of the ways you would grow food in Europe was very similar to that area there. So most people were in that area, and that land got taken up and was pretty much accounted for. What you had left were the mountain areas. They were tougher, harder to grow stuff, colder, more inhospitable, and the natives that were there, particularly the Indians, could defend them a lot better because they knew them better. And it was a hard land to defend. And so it took a certain type person of European descent to be able to live in that area and make it work for them. And that's why you had the Southern Highlanders going up there. Don't mistake it. It was very, very difficult to live. Mm-hmm. It's cold. There's the farmland that's there. A lot of it's hilly. Water can be an issue. The animals can be an issue. And what you can grow there is limited. The thing that made it work and the grain that made it work was corn. And although a lot of the people were Europeans and was strongly a wheat-based society, they switched over to corn, which they learned from the Indians, because you can only grow wheat in a certain area. And so you have a lot of the corn culture rising and producing in these people with cornbreads and even things like hominy. A lot of it was Indian technology, Indian food, but it was adapted to suit their taste and it allowed them to survive.
So what was the relationship like? I mean, did they get along?
Some groups did, and some groups didn't. It depended on how hot the resource was. The Cherokees worked out a pretty good relationship with the, I would say out of all the tribes, particularly with the Southern Highlanders, because the Cherokees were very good at adapting. They saw things from the Western society that they could fit well in their culture or utilize it, and they did. So it was a constant back and forth sharing between the Cherokee and the Southern Highlanders. At the same time, you also have people competing for resources, and there was some friction there. But that's the way it always is. But they got along. You also had groups of Black people that were in those areas. There's a small town up in North Carolina called Texana. Black people have been there for a long time, before slavery. I mean, before the Civil War, they were in these areas here, and they existed with white people and in the Cherokee. And again, the whole system of slavery was going on before the Europeans came to the New World. Slavery was going on before the Europeans came to Africa. It was the way things were done in the world. And in these parts of the area, you had people that were slaves, and you had some people there were even people that weren't quite slaves, but they were still not far from freedmen. They were able to at least run and do things and have small businesses and stuff. Today, you go up to Texana and these areas, people are not so much concerned about race, they're concerned about locality. If you're from the region, they get along with you. If you're of the same race, but you're not from the region, you have a problem.
So some of that cultural in-group, out-group. I mean, if you're
right.
in-group, then you're not as easily accepted. But now I know we want to talk about food, because you definitely, in my mind, have done a lot of research and have a lot of expert information on really how those two have come together, the Cherokee culture as well as the Appalachian culture in terms of food. Now, you've written 2 cookbooks, so why don't we start with maybe telling us a little bit about the Cherokee one.
Cherokee cookbook, which I have here, actually, I actually edited it. And here's a copy of the Cherokee cookbook here. And this was the first Cherokee cookbook that was actually written by a Cherokee Indian, a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, and was done with support of the tribe. Her husband is an Iowa Indian. And so Nancy and Tony Flemings wrote this book. I just served as the editor, and I had the honor of being the editor. And anything that they wanted to put in, I put in. If they didn't want it, and we took it out. It was their call, because prior to this, there was not a single Cherokee cookbook written by a native Cherokee Indian.
And didn't they have friends that are also Cherokee who contributed quite a bit to it, and including Cherokee language is in the book?
The book's the Cherokee language, and when the Cherokee Indians saw that this was their book, the tribe stepped in, and the eastern back of the tribe opened up their archives, and there were other people such as Martin and Lena, who were very, very skilled in speaking fluent Cherokee. And they were involved in the project. and they helped translate the English into Cherokee for it. There was Walker Calhoun, who was a spiritual leader of the Cherokees. He's since passed, but a lot of the Cherokee religion stuff that's in Smithsonian, he was the guy who wrote a lot of the tales and translated it into English. He was also involved in the book. So even if you don't like to cook, you'll learn a tremendous amount about Cherokee culture from the book. You learn a lot more about Cherokee food and their foodways from the book than anything that I think is still currently out there today.
All right, so tell me one or two recipes that's in the book that would be considered Cherokee cooking that might be something that we would say, oh, I've not heard of that, or I've not had it, or that type thing.
Chestnut bread and bean bread, where they take chestnuts, which are found in the mountains, and mix it with corn. Another Cherokee dish is lye dumplings, where they take cornmeal and make it into a patty and cook it in water. And that's another dish. And even old dishes such as yellow jacket stew. It's also mentioned in the book.
Yeah. Now, yellow jacket stew, that's actual yellow jackets. It's not.
You find a yellow jacket nest and you get the grubs out of it. You got to remember that about 60% of the people in the world get their protein from bugs. And it was a reliable source. Up in those, in those mountains, it can be very hard to make a living. So you got to utilize everything.
Yeah.
And animal and insect protein is a very high source of protein. And it's a lot of times easy to find. And the Cherokees utilize it all, as well as fish and birds. And the book also talks about the hunting techniques they would use and the materials they use to make their hunting instruments.
So what type of materials would they use for hunting instruments?
They would use river cane to make blow guns, and the blow guns were darts. They use yellow locust to carve the darts, and they would use bull thistle for the feathery or the foamy part at the end of the dart. And they would use these to hunt small birds. It talks about the bows and arrows, and then traps they would use to catch fishing. And a lot of these things were shared with the Southern Highlanders as well. They learned some of these techniques as well, particularly hunting and stuff like that. So there was a sharing back and forth between the two cultures, what was more efficient, what wasn't. And the Indians, if they found a firearm worked better later on, they would use firearms. And so you had this sharing back and forth. The Cherokees actually became a very prosperous society, and they moved more and more into farming. And they borrowed some of the European techniques, but again, they also used a lot of the things done within the Cherokee style. It's almost equivalent to what you see with the Japanese. They're the best at incorporating foreign culture into their society. I see that definitely was prominent with the Cherokee Indians.
Now, with the Cherokee, I mean, there was quite a bit of crafting as well that, of course, could also go over into the side of food, because they would also make clay pots and things like that were used, or baskets that were used. Because I know there's a basket that they use for carrying water.
Yeah, they use a double weave bat for water. They use some baskets for the cooking. So that was, again, a lot of the things they would utilize for different food products. The Southern Highlanders, again, a lot of the foods that the Cherokees loved became favorite for the Southern Highlanders. A good example is ramps, which are now all the rage, but ramps are something that the Southern Highlanders learned from the Cherokee Indians, and they learned how to harvest them. But there's a difference. When the Indians harvested ramps, they only harvested the leaves. They never took the bulb. To the Indians, it's a sacrilege to dig up the whole ramp, bulbs and all, because they left the bulbs in place so that you could have more ramps and the supply would be sustainable. We haven't learned that today. Today, we're taking way more of the bulbs and not leaving them in the ground. The reason the Cherokees did this because they lived in these mountains for thousands of years, and they ran into times when they overabused the resource. And then they learned how not to overabuse it and to have it available for future generations. So that's something that, we need to always respect and learn. We can learn from them.
Absolutely. But now you've also written a book on Appalachian cooking, and you actually wrote that book. And as well, I think you did both with that one. And that book, oh wow, yeah, see right on the cover you have pumpkins, and is that sorghum?
It's sorghum and a pumpkin, and it's basically the pumpkin is a pumpkin nose of kashaw. There are two pumpkins that were developed, and there was actually a bit more than that, but there were two common pumpkins well known that were developed in the Appalachian area. One is the kashaw, and they were developed by the Cherokee Indians. It's a sweet pumpkin. They can get quite big, sometimes upwards to 3 to 3.5 feet in size. There's another pumpkin which they call the candy roaster, which was developed by the Cherokee Indians. And here's a candy roaster here, and this is a small candy roaster. It used to get up to 5 feet long and very big. And it's a very sweet pumpkin. It has a good keeping pumpkin. It can keep for several months. And it was utilized by the Cherokee as well as the Southern Highlanders. It was a pumpkin that was designed to grow in that type of region, did well in that good, thick black mountain dirt with a lot of fertilizer, manure, and rich compost.
But what are some of the different things that were made with the pumpkin? Because I'm thinking that there'll be more than pies.
Well, yeah, pies would be mostly a European influence. The Indians used pumpkin because pumpkin's high in nutrients. There's a lot of carbs in there and a lot of nutrients in it. And they would take the pumpkin and they would dry it out when it was off season. When it was during season, they'd eat the seeds. They'd roast the pumpkin. They'd mix it with a few of the herbs, and the pumpkin was constantly used. So the pumpkin would be mixed in with cornmeal to thicken the corn mush that they would be making, and that's how the pumpkin was eaten. You didn't have much sweets in the Cherokee diet. The Europeans and the Southern Highlanders brought sweets, but the sweets that they brought, sugar came late because sugar was very expensive. So around the early to mid 1800s, you had sorghum introduced, and here's some sorghum here. And sorghum is a sap that comes out of a plant called sorghum. The plant is actually from Africa. It migrated from Africa to India to China and eventually made it over to the United States. And you take this plant and you run it through a mill like you do sugarcane, and you grind the juice out. You boil the juice, and the juice thickens and it sweetens, and you have a sweetener called sorghum, which does not taste like molasses because it's not molasses. Some people call it molasses, but it's not. And it has a sorghum sweet taste with a lot of aftertones. Very, very great product. And that was used a lot in Southern cooking because it can grow in cooler climates. Whereas you can't grow sugarcane in the mountains, you could grow sorghum. And that was used to sweeten a lot of things. And it was more affordable in the Southern Appalachian area than sugar was.
So are you saying then that Europeans brought that, or is that how sorghum?
Europeans brought sorghum, but it came over via China.
Via China.
From China, it came over to the U.S. But the plant itself is originally from Africa. It's one of the key African crops. And the Europeans used it, particularly the Southern Highlands, because it worked well. It grew well in that area there. So in a state like Georgia, up in the mountains, they grow sorghum, and down the Georgia coast, we grow sugarcane. But it's a sweetener, and a sweetener allows you to make things taste good, but a sweetener also is a good preservative. You can preserve things with it with a sweetener. And that allows you to preserve a lot of things, whether it's meat or plant matter, and it also allows you things to taste good. Because in the Cherokee diet, there was no sweetener such as this.
Now, what about gathering? Because I know that you and I have gone out with our Cherokee friends to do some gathering in the wild. So what are some of the things that we can share with our listeners that can tell them a little bit about what they gather in terms of their food in the wild?
In the Appalachia, you had the two groups. You had the Southern Appalachians and you had the Cherokees. And the Cherokee, the book that I edited is called Cherokee Cooking from the Mountains to the Garden. And in the Cherokee, the garden extended out into the woods, up into the mountains. People harvested stuff that they could get, and things came at a certain time. And you had to do things at a certain time. When nature was ready, you had to be there. If you missed what nature did, you starved. And so the whole thing of religions, the whole thing of mythologies is to put you in phase with nature, put you in harmony with nature. So you learn to do things when nature was ready, not when you want to do it or you want to transform it. You do it when nature is ready. And so we would go and we'd harvest greens. In the spring, we would harvest the wild greens. You'd harvest ramps. You'd harvest sochan. You'd harvest a lot of the greens that they had. And a lot of the Southern Highlanders even fell in love with some of the native Cherokee greens. They also liked the European greens, which was your collard greens. Turnips were more common. Turnips and mustards more so than collards, but collards were also very popular. And these greens were eaten a bit for a longer period. But in the spring, when the mountain greens came out, people went out and gathered them, and they gathered what they could. You find them in groups. Sometimes you find a patch of a lot, sometimes a patch of a little. But if you mix all the various greens together, you get what you get a mess.
You get a what?
And with that mess of greens, you have a mess. That's a quantity, which means enough to make a meal. And if you had that, that was all you needed to eat. And they'd eat it until the season ended, and then they'd move on to some of the other greens that you would plant, such as your turnips and your mustards and stuff like that.
And what would they use for seasoning the greens and some of the foods that they would prepare?
A lot of the seasoning from stuff came from the variety. They did have salt. The Indians would use something called spice bush berry, and it was a plant that produced a berry in the fall. and you could dry the berries out and use some of them later on in certain foods. But you had to make sure they were really, really dried. Or they would use wild garlic was another favorite they would use. And a lot of times the seasoning was also pieces of meat. The Southern Highlanders was pork. Pork was king. Originally, before the Europeans came, the Indians, it was bear. Bear fat was quite prominent. But later on, it became pork. Porks were, pigs were more abundant, and then pork fat became the flavoring for everything, because there wasn't much dairy in the Southern Appalachian areas. Most of the dairy farmers that were eventually settled in the area, they came from, they were German and came in later. Butter was still a very hard to get commodity. So your primary form of oil or grease was lard. And even today, I mean, lard has just as much cholesterol as butter, so they're quite equivalent. Yeah. Some people think lard is worse, but actually it's probably a little less than lard than there is butter. But that was the primary thing they would use to season things with.
But what about other little things like rabbits or raccoons or things like that? I mean, were the Cherokees hunting those type things, or was it more just the Europeans or vice versa?
Cherokees, you hunted whatever you could get. You got to be pretty smart to be a hunter, and the animals may not cooperate. Well, when people hunted, they hunted and got what they could. And the Europeans learned what animals to hunt from the Cherokee. You couldn't always get a deer. They were familiar with deer, but and the buffalo at that point were weaning. There are a lot of people don't realize buffalo used to exist in the Appalachia. It was a forest buffalo. Actually, it was bigger than a buffalo in the plains. Oh, wow. And those animals used to exist, and that was part of their diet that they used to hunt. But eventually, the forest buffalo pretty much got overhunted. And so it
was called the what type buffalo?
It was a forest type buffalo. It was a big buffalo. But eventually that animal left. It got overhunted. And then you had the plains buffalo. But the people in the area with the buffalo going down low numbers, deer was the primary animal, deer and then pork. You could raise pigs. Pigs eat very little food versus other animals, and they get big very, very fast. And it's very easy to preserve their meat. So you had ceremonies. The Indians had ceremonies that they would do to preserve the pork, and the Europeans had the same type of ceremonies where you would take, and you'd have to be pork renderings, where you would take an animal, you'd butcher it, you'd bleed it, and it was done as a group. Because although it was very difficult, there was no such thing as a lone survivor in the Appalachians. You couldn't survive by yourself. Yeah. You had to have clans. It was just too harsh an environment. You get a hard winter that was very, very hard, and it could wipe out the crops you put away. So how do you survive when the crops you put away have been or exhausted or got ruined? You can store corn in something called a corn crib, which is basically a cage device you put corn in, but sometimes rodents run rapid in it. Sometimes the corn gets fungus in it and it all spoils. Well, what do you do in that case? Well, that's when the Southern Highlanders learned from the Indians. There are some natural tubers, plants that grow in the woods. Later on, the potato came over, and that took the place of what they would call the wild potato. The Indians had a clan that specialized in wild tubers called the wild potato clan. And certain Indian tribes, like Nancy Flemings, who wrote the Cherokee book, her family was named the Big Meat, and they were known for their processing of pork.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very, very fascinating. Now, where can people get your books? Because both of them, I would think, are just a wealth of knowledge and information for anyone interested in both cultures, the Native American culture as well as the Appalachian culture.
Well, there's two places you can get it. One, you can contact me through my email at williamthomas@me.com, and that's the best way to contact to find out about it. And I'll go and get back to you. The books cost about $25 each, and the Cherokee book is not owned by me; it's owned by Nancy Fleming. So I've got to make arrangements with her if I'm selling any of those books so she knows about it.
Mm-hmm. Both very good reads. So is there anything that I've left out? Because Dr. You're such a wealth of information that I'm sure that there's a question that I didn't ask, but you have some thoughts about something that you can add.
Oh, just briefly, there's a lot of unique things in the mountains. One, I talked about sweeteners such as sorghum. Yeah. We have a unique honey in the area, which is sourwood honey from the sourwood tree, which grows up there. And that's a honey that has a really, really nice flavor. New crops like sorghum, because sorghum, not only can you eat you get the syrup from it, you can also eat the grain head that it has with it. There's plants like spice bushberry, a lot of stews, breads. It's an area in which there are a lot of new things being discovered every day. and bright young chefs. Even one of probably the most famous chefs in the world, Chef Sean Brock. His whole endeavor now is Appalachia, because he is was actually born in the Appalachian area of West Virginia, but he also realizes now that that's the area where I think if you're a young chef and you're a young foodie and you want to find unusual ingredients, that's the place to be. Great new ingredients, a lot of diversity there, and I think it'll be the next place where we find a lot of great culinary discoveries coming from.
Yeah, a lot of creativity there and opportunities for it.
Exactly right.
But thank you so much for joining me. We could go on and talk more and more. So I have to
Okay.
Thank you.